Hey guys, it's an unusual time for me to be on, and I'm sure it's unusual for a lot of you guys as well. Obviously, if you're in America, it's fairly early start to your day, whereas where I am, the sun is up. It's basically the middle of the day. I've just had some lunch. I'm actually sitting here in wet swimming trunks, so I'll try and get on with it. Um, Good to see quite a few of you here. Susan B., Amy Hall, Isimko Belinsky. What we are dealing with today is something that's quite close to my heart. I've written 5 books on the Madeleine McCann case. It's, I think, the only major case that I've actually gone to the scene of the crime. I've gone to Praia de Luge. I've spent quite a long time in Praia de Luge, running around at the same time that this whole thing happened in May. I was there in early May, um, doing all sorts of research, which led to 2 books. And so I must say, I've certainly been awaiting this verdict very impatiently, very keenly, and I was hoping it would go the way that it did, and I was expecting it to go the way that it did. I kind of also want to talk about folks that, is there anyone here that thought it would go a different way? And you kind of got to wonder why that is. In other words, why were you surprised at the verdict? Also, what is going on with the British media? That the British media for the past 15 years have been incredibly biased. And I think the British media should hang their heads in shame where we are now. What has been this nonsense about Christian Bruckner for the past 2 years, right? Why have we had this nonsensical coverage about Christian Bruckner for the past 2 years? Like, cuckoo. Anyway, Victoria, good to see you here. Cotton Star says, this is a huge decision for justice. I couldn't say that any better. So I have asked a question, which is in the poll, which is, does this ruling mean the McCanns have lost the right to be presumed innocent? We're going to talk about that because it's quite an important question. There's a fairly simple answer to that question, but then there's also a counterpoint to that question, which I think is quite important to bring up as well. Esen Kobelinsky says, I was afraid it might go a different way, agreed about the media. Thanks a lot, Victoria. I know, Victoria, you are in the UK. It is interesting that all of this has happened in the middle of the huge pageantry of the Queen's funeral, right? It's quite interesting timing. Is it coincidence? Is it fortuitous for the McCanns? Because I think it suits the McCanns that this negative publicity has come out when the whole of England is thinking about something else. Are they really going to care about the McCanns? Well, put it this way, aren't they going to care the least about this case now than at any other time? If you think about it. Karen Ann says, I'm in the UK. So for those who don't know, I'm sure I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know. The Madeleine McCann case is the most heavily reported missing persons case in history. Now, I think that really applies to the mainstream media. I don't know whether the Gabby Petito case, in terms of tweets and so on, didn't surpass Madeleine McCann in that sense, but certainly in terms of mainstream media, front pages dedicated to one case, definitely Madeleine McCann. And it's no accident. The parents hired PR people, the parents put their story out there, and the PR narrative basically cowed the Portuguese. They had to deal with press hounding them all the time. The Portuguese protocol is to keep a case not secret, but to not talk about it publicly. And so there's a little loophole that you may not be talking about a case publicly, but your PR representatives can make all sorts of statements kind of on your behalf. And so that is exactly what happened. So the Portuguese police have got to say nothing. Meanwhile, you can get ahead of the narrative, and that's exactly what happened. And they did such a great job that it became the most heavily reported case in history, not true crime history, true crime, right? And I think one can argue that whole momentum has started running out now. That PR machine has started sort of running dry, running out of fuel, coming to the 15-year point. You could only push the Christian Bruckner story for so long before it got quite old. Oh, the imminent arrest is about to take place, and then you report the same thing a month later, 6 months later, the prime suspect is about to be arrested. And then it's a year later, Christian Bruckner is about to stand trial. It's going to happen any second now, except it just doesn't happen. And then this verdict comes out. So anyway, we're gonna review the ruling, and as we reviewed, I'm going to take you guys through some of the backstory. Now, by the way, if you Google Madeleine McCann right now, there's no mention whatsoever of an appeal. You would imagine that they would instantly say, we're appealing this. And you would imagine if they really believe that they're innocent, that they would appeal it. Because as far as I know, I could be wrong about this. It's something I read in a publication that said they've got either 3 weeks to appeal or 3 months to appeal. I'm not 100% sure, but typically the highest courts, you can't appeal. So I'm not 100% sure whether it can be appealed, but if it can be appealed, you would expect that they would have announced that yesterday, right? And I'm very interested to see if they do appeal, because if they're so convinced of their innocence, then they should appeal it. And then what's going to be the result of the appeal? So that'll be definitely very interesting to see how the McCanns react. So far, it seems like there's no reaction, which is also quite bizarre. Because they always, anyway, let's just look at what Cotton Star says. True crime students, the 3 biggest missing persons cases, Ramsey, McCann, and Petito, were never missing persons. Such a great point as well. John Benet Ramsey was never kidnapped, never missing. And the whole intruder narrative has persisted for 25 years, despite the, the grand jury decision in that case, which everyone conveniently forgets. Gabby Petito was never missing, although it was suggested that through those text messages, right, saying that no signal in Yosemite, right? Anyway, let's get down to that judgment. So this is from I think before I get to that, I want to deal with something that is from that judgment. Before we get into any of that, I want to first deal with the legality. It comes from the judgment, basically says the applicant's complaint concerning their right to be presumed innocent was thus manifestly ill-founded, right? In other words, they don't have the right to be presumed innocent. That's the answer to the poll. No, they don't have the right to be presumed innocent, according to this ruling. The flip side of that is they have the right not to be presumed guilty. So it's not a case of they are not innocent, thus they are guilty. It's they are not innocent according to the law, and they're not guilty, so they're somewhere in between. It's sort of undecided. It's inconclusive. It's basically an area where the law is sort of murky, and the law basically can't be persuaded one way or the other, right? But it's certainly a little bit of a different case to what has been said all along by certain people. Ruth says, I thought the European Court of Human Rights might be swayed by the British mainstream media and fake suspect. Yeah, I mean, the important part there is the European media isn't the British media. And I think there was a little bit of coverage probably in the German media, but I don't think that was sufficient. The European Court is in Strasbourg, which is France. I don't know if too many people in France are going to be paying attention to German media. And these are High Court, Supreme Court judges, or very, very, it's not like a low-level court. These are very learned legal practitioners. They don't really pay attention to the media. They pay attention to the law, right? So let's go through this ruling. I want to start off with really the end before we get to the beginning. It deals with having regard to these findings. The court concludes that the applicant's complaint is manifestly ill-founded and as such inadmissible, and so it must be rejected. Now, I just think you must think about those words. The applicant's complaint, that's not the applicant's complaint. It is two doctors from Britain, their complaint, right? Two good doctors, respected doctors, the folks that have been really setting the tone for this narrative all along for the past 15 years. These very respected doctors from Britain, their complaint in this high court in Europe has been regarded as manifestly ill-founded. I must say the word ill in the context of the doctors, what's the word? You could almost call it the healthy pursuit of justice. Well, the European Court has found it not very healthy. They found it ill-founded, right? In terms of the law. Sunny Tanner, hi from Southeast Florida. Good to see you here. Bria Lace from France says, it seems suspicious the story dragged on so long and was possibly strategically released at a time when people would care least. Certainly, I think the British public care least about this news. And I've got to say, for the coverage that they were giving bumper to bumper on Bruckner, could this be the suspect? Could this be the suspect? On and on up until about 2 weeks ago. And then when news comes out that there's going to be a ruling, we couldn't care less. We're not going to really pay attention to that in the media. So the whole Bruckner saga is basically saying, could there be a trial in the Madeleine McCann case? Could a prime suspect be put on trial? Is there going to be like a court case where we're going to find out what really happened? Meanwhile, there's a legal process underway. But no, we don't want to pay attention to that. That doesn't really suit us. Biased, very, very biased. Yeah, very, very biased. Now, I wouldn't say the UK law is rubbish. I would say the UK media is extremely biased. And I think if you want to make the case that fake news exists, and I'm someone who's more supportive of the mainstream media than most. I used to work for magazines and newspapers and so on. But I think if you want to make the case that mainstream media is biased, unreliable, and fake, then I think the British coverage of this case over the past, especially the past year or two, it certainly makes the case for whoa. And that's why I say I think British media should hang their heads in shame, given what's going on now. And you would actually expect them to make some sort of statement, while our coverage is being slanted a certain way, and this outcome seems to be kind of surprising. Why is that? And I don't think they will do that. They'll just sort of shrug and go on. Some of the coverage I've seen now is already basically saying that the McCann's going to appeal. It's not really accepting the ruling for what it is. And it's also not going to any trouble to check the veracity of any of the things that have been going on. They're not interested in that. Karen Ann says, how long does one have to be missing to declare their death? About 7 years. Madeleine's been missing more than twice that length of time. And of course, the McCanns want the search for Madeleine to go on. Madeleine's still out there, according to them. Madeleine's still missing. and they want the search to go on. And I'm not sure if it's still publicly funded. Is the search for Madeleine funded by public donations, right? Marcus Haysom, Heineck from Luxembourg, good to see you. So let's go through the ruling. It's quite interesting, and I'm going to break through about halfway through to deal with some of the history that some of you may know about, some of you may not know about. So let's bring that up. I try to get the actual document, but unfortunately, if any of you guys have got a link to the actual document, this is the best I can do for right now. So I hope you guys can read it with me. So it's issued by the registrar of the court. It's case number 57195-/17. It says no violation of the convention by the Portuguese civil courts in decisions concerning a book about Madeleine McCann's parents. So if you think about it, this whole thing is about libel. It's about slander. It's about, can we shut down this writer's work? This person has written stuff about us. Can we shut him down? Can we prevent him from talking about us? Can we prevent him, and he's the investigator, can we prevent him from actually speaking about what he saw and his assessments, right? In other words, it's about controlling the narrative. It's about shutting down a policeman who was kicked out, who was the main detective. And if you think about it, the same thing happened in the John Benet Ramsey case. The lead detective was kicked off, and then the lead detective wrote a book, and then the Ramseys sued that lead detective, and somehow he was still able to publish the book, and it came out. That's the book by what's his name? Steve. I should really remember it. Just can't think of his name now. Who's the detective in charge of the Ramsey case? Steve. That is really a bit of a brain fart. Steve Thomas. Wow, I can't believe I couldn't think of that. I mean, I've got his book. I've been reading his book and so on. Anyway, so Steve Thomas was also, they tried to shut him down. So let's go through this. In today's chamber judgment in the case of Mccann and Healy is the maiden name of Madeleine's mother. And it's quite interesting that that is how she legally represents herself, with a maiden name, right? So it's Jerry Mccann and Kate Healy, even though Kate was married to Jerry at the time, versus Portugal. You almost get a sense that they're trying to separate them into two different parties, almost like Laurie Vallow and Chad Daybell, and Laurie Vallow doesn't want to, do you know what I mean? It's quite interesting. Yeah, Steve Thomas. Sorry, Cotton Star. I mean, I've got to hang my head in shame for that faux pas. I mean, anyway. So it was a unanimous verdict. It wasn't like a split verdict as well. So it's a strong judgment. And they say they found no violation of Article 8, right to respect for private and family life, of the European Convention on Human Rights. So in other words, they basically said the detective had a right to write about the McCann's involvement in a particular case, and we'll get to some of the details there. And you've got to, just before you go into this at all, you've got to kind of laugh to say, so a Portuguese detective may not write a book, but the McCanns themselves wrote a book. There have been countless documentaries, countless interviews, hundreds of PR moments, but no, we want to be private. Please don't look at us. It's just kind of it's a massive contradiction. Faticus, good to see you here. Oh, so there has been a reaction. Let's have a look at that. Let's have a look at that. Let's see if there's any sign of an appeal. Let's see if there's any sign of an appeal. I actually can't find the Guardian source for that. I'm not quite sure why. Well, I can't. If can you guys can you guys share the link here for the article about the McCann's being naturally disappointed, unless it's in this article. Oh, there it is. The McCanns now have 3 months to appeal the decision. In a statement, they said they were naturally disappointed. We took action for one and only one reason: Mr. Amaral's unfounded claims were having a detrimental impact on the search for Madeleine. Well, has Madeleine been found in 15 years? Yeah, I don't know why I can't bring it up. Anyway, let's go through this article. The case concerns statements made by a former detective inspector in a book, a documentary, and a newspaper interview. So it's his book, it's a documentary that he appeared in, and I think it's a documentary that only sort of appeared in Portuguese. I think the documentary was based on the book called Truth of the Lie. And then it's also based on a newspaper interview. So 3 different areas. And they're saying that is what concerned the McCanns about, which spoke about their alleged involvement in the disappearance of their daughter, Madeleine McCann. So if you take this in broad strokes, basically a detective alleged in a book, in a documentary, in a newspaper interview, that the McCanns were involved in their own daughter's disappearance. They challenged that, they complained against that, and the European court said, sorry, you can't. You can't complain against that. Interesting, isn't it? It refers to Madeleine McCann went missing on 3rd May 2007 in southern Portugal. Before the court, the applicants alleged that there had been a violation of their right to reputation and to their right to be presumed innocent, right? And so it looks like the court is basically saying you didn't have a right to be presumed innocent, right? As, what's the word? Kind of blasphemous as that sounds, like, what on earth did you just say? They don't have a right to be presumed innocent? Well, that is exactly what this ruling, as far as I understand it, seems to be saying, that they don't have the right to be presumed innocent. I must say at the same time that they also have the right not to be presumed guilty, if that makes sense. And if that doesn't make sense to you, there are 2 kind of intertextual cases that are quite prominent right now. One is Adnan Syed. He's just been released from prison, and he's not going to be able to sue for wrongful imprisonment, because although he's been found to be not necessarily guilty, it doesn't mean that he's presumed completely innocent. There's a difference between the 2. Can you guys see that? So it's kind of the middle ground. It's saying you guys are not to be presumed innocent, but also not to be presumed guilty. It's quite a weird middle ground, isn't it? Anyway, the court considered that even assuming that the applicant's reputation had been damaged, this was not on account of the argument put forward by the book's author, but rather as a result of the suspicions expressed against them, which had led to their being placed under investigation in the course of the criminal investigation. In other words, they're saying it wasn't the detective who was for the first time and out of a vacuum saying that he found them suspicious. he was saying these suspicions kind of were born out of the investigation, right? You see that as a result of the suspicions expressed against them, which led to their being placed under investigation, right? It goes on to say the prosecutor's office decided to take no further action in July 2008. Remember that date. Remember July 2008. We're going to come back to what was going on behind the scenes in the legal narrative at sort of this time. So it refers to intense media attention and much controversy. So I think a question you could ask is, did any other media talk about the McCanns being suspects? You know, did it ever appear anywhere in the media that the McCanns were suspects? Right? Well, they were made official suspects by the Portuguese. So how on earth can you say, I mean, if they were made suspects, well, then something they did was suspicious by inference. Like anyone who is, what's the word? There's a case takes place, and then you are made a suspect. Someone's going to say, I wonder if you did something wrong because you're a suspect. You know, is that defamatory? So anyway, it goes on to say, the information had thus been brought to the public's attention in some detail even before the investigation file was made available to the media and the book in question was published. It followed that the national authorities had not failed in their positive obligation to protect the applicant's right to respect for their private life. In other words, what they were talking about is there was a file, like the discovery file of the McCanns, that it's called, sometimes referred to as the PJ files or the Mccann case files. All of this is available online, by the way. Anyone can read them. They've been translated. You had a similar thing in the Amanda Knox case where a lot of the details was in Italian, but then people translated them. Sometimes the translations were sort of biased or misleading, but in this case, you also had the PJ files released, which means when the discovery was released to the public, anyone could have gone and looked at those files and read what was in them, right? And so if you read something in there and you thought, wow, that's suspicious or that's strange, or wow, they've actually found this evidence, should you be defamed because you saw something that was in official police investigative documents released to the public? And it was released not prematurely. The Mccann PR machine got a huge head start. So by the time the actual information from the police came through, it sort of was like on the outside of this huge fortress of information that had already been established in the mind of the media, right? Thanks a lot, Susan. Flame Lily says, I was sympathetic at first, but as the case continued and more facts came out, I became suspicious. They were made official suspects for a time. We're going to deal with that as well. Like simply the question of, were they made official suspects, and then did somebody say, okay, you're not suspects anymore? We're going to deal with that. So that's also part of the media narrative that the media itself seemed to have forgotten about. Then it says the court also considered that in the Supreme Court's judgments of January and March 2017, and I'm going to be referring to that, right? So 10 years into this whole saga, there were the Supreme Court's judgments in Portugal concerning the civil claims lodged by the applicants. It had not made comments implying any guilt on the part of the applicants or even suggesting suspicions against them with regard to the circumstances in which their daughter disappeared. The applicant's complaint concerning their right to be presumed innocent was thus manifestly ill-founded. So now we deal with the principal facts. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Let me bring this up a little bit more. The applicants, Gerald Patrick Mccann and Kate Marie Healy, are British nationals who were both born in 1968. They lived in Leicestershire in the United Kingdom. In May 2007, while the applicants were on holiday with their 3 children in southern Portugal, their daughter Madeleine Mccann, then aged 3, she was a few days short of 4 years old, disappeared. On the following day, an investigation was opened by the prosecutor's office, whose lines of inquiry focused on a probable abduction. That's how they started it. They started investigating an abduction. Why? Because that's what the McCanns told them. They said she's been taken. And it was months later that the police started thinking, this doesn't seem like an abduction. Let's start investigating other possibilities. So I don't think you can accuse the detective or the police of a rush to judgment or of focusing on the McCanns. They'll say that, I think. They'll say, why did they not look at other people? Why did they just focus on us? Well, they started off basically being told, go and look at this and go and investigate that. Basically being, in a way, it kind of felt like they were being ordered around. There's been a sighting over there, and then the cops would sort of run off, like running errands. You had the same thing in the John Benet Ramsey case. The cops would run errands. It was almost like doing the bidding of somebody else. And only much, much later did the investigation cycle back round, come kind of back full circle, where they said, you know what, maybe we need to actually look at apartment 5A. We shouldn't be looking for Madeleine in Spain or Morocco or Belgium or Poland or South America. Maybe we should actually kind of start our investigation in the apartment, right? And then guess what happened when they did that? So that's the next part here. It says the investigation was entrusted to Inspector Gonzalo Amaral, just abbreviate his name, from the Criminal Investigation Department. And here it gets really interesting. Biological and blood samples were subsequently detected by British sniffer dogs inside the holiday apartment and in the trunk of a vehicle that the applicants had rented a few days after their daughter's disappearance. As a result, the parents were placed under investigation in September 2007. So when you follow the McCann story and the British media's cheerleading of that story, you'll kind of get the sense, and also it's in the Netflix documentary, you'll get the sense that, oh, the sniffer dogs, that's ridiculous. That's just, right? That's kind of the sense you get from it. There's also Jerry McCann in the media himself, kind of snorting, well, not snorting, basically just sort of seemingly having contempt for the reporter talking about the dogs, right? There's actually a video clip where he says something like, ask the dogs, right? And anyway, the whole response from the McCanns was that the dogs are silly, the dogs are unreliable, the dogs are nothing. Don't pay attention to it. It really means absolutely nothing. And you kind of get the idea that people took their cue from them and said, these people are a lot more intelligent than what we are. These are 2 doctors. They know what they're talking about. So we're not going to pay any attention to the dogs. That's where we jump a little bit out of the story and we deal with the Jerry McCann's legal attempt to dispute the reliability of the cadaver dogs. And this was exactly in like the end of August, sort of 31st of August 2007. That's when the sniffer dogs came in. And what Jerry tried to do was refer to case law showing how unreliable the sniffer dogs were. And he found a case that was playing out in America right then, the Zapata case, right, where a judge basically said, you know what, we are not going to we are not going to accept the reliability of cadaver dogs. And that was perfect ammunition for Jerry McCann to say, you see, there's case law showing this, that cadaver dogs are totally unreliable. And it happened fortuitously right when he needed it. I want to bring up some of that coverage, if I may. Let's see if I can find it. Just give me a second. I'm going to be really angry if I didn't send myself this information, because I worked quite long and hard to actually get it. Okay, here it is. It's about to get pretty angry. Okay, so this is the article I'm referring to. You can see the date, 16 September 2007. I don't know why this always happens. Bring it back down. 16 September 2007. So this was basically 2 weeks after the cadaver dogs had done their thing, and it was sort of in this period where it was about a week after the Mccanns had actually been made formal suspects in Portugal. And so the Mccanns consult American lawyers over cadaver dog evidence, right? So this was how they were trying to counter the accusations against them, right? And they, it says here, they went to deal with a case where cadaver dog evidence was key, right? And it also refers to here, cadaver dogs picked up a scent of death on everything from Mrs. Mccann's clothes to missing Madeleine's favorite soft toy cuddle cat, right? Now, this is way back in 2007, right? The scent of death on clothing and on Madeleine's toy. Meanwhile, it's like, no, Madeleine's still out there, and we don't want to affect the investigation. We don't want to hurt the investigation into Madeleine. Meanwhile, here's an article from September 2007 talking about the scent of death on Madeleine's toys and on her mother's clothes. This article refers to video of the animal going crazy when it approached their Renault Scenic hire car. Talks about dog's reaction. And so they want to highlight the judge's dismissal of cadaver dog evidence in the high-profile Eugene Zapata murder trial in Madison, Wisconsin, right? The couple's lawyers have already contacted the Zapata defense team and are now sending their large file on the matter to Britain, right? So now I want to talk to you guys a little bit about that judgment, and it really is fascinating. Let's see if I can just bring up. So can you guys read that? Attorneys want cadaver dogs excluded from murder trial. Eugene Zapata was charged with I think that's the wrong one. I think I've just jumped the gun there. Is it this one? Yeah, okay, so that's not quite the one that I want to show you guys. Okay, these are a couple of headlines from America, right? Judge, evidence from cadaver dogs cannot be used at murder trial. Look at the date, August 31st, 2007. Here's another one. Cadaver sniffing testimony tossed out of Zapata trial, September 1st, 2007. Mccann's consult U.S. Law expert over scent of death, right? 17 September 2007, right? So do you follow what this is about? This was how the Mccanns way back in September were trying to legally defend themselves against the whole cadaver dog evidence and the suspicion there. And I think in a way the case turns on the following. It turns on the, let's call it a fact, or that's really the problem. Is it a fact or is it a potential fact? Let's call it the potential fact of blood evidence, DNA, etc., found in various locations. And the Mccann saying, well, if it's blood, it could be fish blood. If it's DNA, it could be our daughter's sister's DNA. In other words, it is DNA, but is it from this person or that person? It is blood, but is it animal blood or human blood? So in other words, it's neither here nor there. You can't 100% prove it, but it is nevertheless problematic, right? So anyway, the strategy Jerry took was to go into this case that had just taken place and say, you see, you can't use cadaver dogs in cases, right? The big joke is that a year later, this particular person, Eugene Zapata, who was being basically able to defend himself based on rejecting the cadaver dog evidence, he later admitted to committing the crime, and all these places where the cadaver dog alerted, he had ended up leaving the remains of his basically dismembered his wife and then left her remains all over the place. And the cadaver dogs had alerted in all sorts of different places. So in other words, a year later, the cadaver dog evidence was basically validated. It turned out there were human remains. It turned out that he did murder his wife. It turned out where the remains were, the dogs did alert, right? And so does that make sense? So in other words, the Mccann's defense was effective in 2007 to say, yeah, you can't do anything with cadaver dog evidence. But then a year later, when they archived the case, effectively when the case was over, well, then that whole thing kind of came around the other way, where they said, oh, well, it looks like the cadaver. And if you think about it today, just how often cadaver dogs are used in cases. They were used in the Scott Peterson case. That was really amazing use of cadaver dogs in terms of being able to smell the scent along a road and even along water. But there have been cadaver dogs in many, many other cases as well. Casey Anthony, fairly recently in the Patrick Frazee case. One wonders why they weren't used, or if they were used, why they didn't alert in the Kylie Rodney case. One wonders what happened there. So I'm going to quickly just read some of the information around these around this particular case. Really interesting to go into. A former state worker ended one of the city's most enduring mysteries by pleading guilty to killing his wife in 1976, explaining how he moved her dismembered body multiple times to conceal the crime. A judge Monday sentenced Eugene Zapata to just 5 years in prison on charges of reckless homicide. And so it says he first wrapped his wife's body in a tent, cleaned up her blood, loaded her body in his truck. He said he was scared, and then he drove around for a long time looking for a place to hide the body. Eventually dumped it in some bushes in an isolated farm field. But basically, this article just talks about how there was this sort of relay race where he moved his wife's body from one point to another point to another point to another point. And the cadaver dogs found traces, I think it was in the basement and somewhere else. And people said, that can't be right. It can't be right that the cadaver dogs alerted there and there. It just doesn't make any sense. Well, it does if someone was dismembered. It does if they were transferred, right? So the cadaver dogs turned out to be totally validated, but it was like too late. One presumes that the McCanns fielded in their legal defense, and at the time it was sound. Well, a year later it was kind of less sound. Does that make sense? Are you guys following what I'm getting at? So the other thing that was really interesting around this time was that the McCanns went to see the Pope. Just a little bit earlier. They went to see the Pope, and that was sort of part of the sort of whole PR narrative, right? This is an image from that particular visit to the Pope. And what's interesting is they went to see the Pope. You can see that's the date is 30th of May 2007. They went to see the Pope, and the Pope put the visit on his website. And then about a couple of months later, they were made suspects, and then he took it off, right? Someone made a really funny comment about that. I just want to bring that up. So here's another image from that visit to the Pope. It's quite interesting that it's referred to here as unanswered prayers, that they sort of went to the Pope and prayed for whatever, and then the title of this article is Unanswered Prayers. I just find it quite ironic. So I'm reading from the, what's the name of this blog again? It is the Maddie Case Files. I think her name's Jill, the author of this particular blog post, but Jilly C. Yeah. So it says here, this is dated September 19, 2007. Vatican removes all reference to McCann's visit from website. So when the parents of Madeleine flew to Rome to visit the Pope, the world media applauded the couple's unwavering faith and graciousness of His Holiness in extending his hand, right? And so they were blessed. And then, of course, there we go. Suspicion fell on them, and then it became necessary to preempt a PR disaster. So I love the way that this is said. Trying to ignore the worldly notion of innocent until proven guilty, the Vatican removed all mention of the Pope's meeting with the McCanns, right? So can you see how you have this selective whitewashing, the selective washing out of the media? They appear with the Pope, and of course, those pictures are burned in the public consciousness. But when they become suspects, well, now let's quietly just take that off the website. Let's not really confront that aspect. Let's just sort of put that away. And it's quite interesting that this idea of a PR disaster for the Vatican. Well, a lot of this whole case was about PR. A lot of it was about PR. So now I want to deal with this question, were they still suspects in 2017? This seemed to catch a lot of people by surprise. It was like, the McCanns aren't suspects. You know, the McCanns aren't suspected of anything in their daughter's disappearance. They're searching for pedophile abductors. The McCanns aren't suspects. And so as late as 10 years into the narrative, the Portuguese court basically had to kind of say, what's the word, unambiguously, well, this is the situation. So it comes from this article. So while I'm waiting for it to load, it's once again this idea of you are not presumed innocent, but neither can you be presumed guilty. It's that sort of middle road, right? And I think the Mccanns have used this whole thing of, well, you can't presume us guilty. But the flip side is, can they be presumed innocent? So let me just bring this up. So do you see that this is from 9 February 2017? Madeleine McCann's parents have not been ruled innocent, judge says. They've not been ruled innocent. And that came out through the course of this, the Supreme Court testing of whether the detective had defamed them, whether he'd said anything that was unwarranted. So I want to bring up an excerpt from that article, and this is from the Telegraph. It says the archiving of this case, let me bring it up a bit more. The archiving of the case was determined by the fact that public prosecutors hadn't managed to obtain sufficient evidence of the practice of crimes by the appellants. So you can say there's not sufficient evidence, therefore you're not guilty. But I suppose you could also argue there is some evidence. If I understand this right, there is some evidence which means we can't say you not innocent. Sorry, we can't say that you're innocent, right? Let me read this in full. So it goes on to say, there's therefore a significant and not merely semantic difference between the legally admissible foundations of the archive ruling. It doesn't therefore seem acceptable that the ruling based on the insufficiency of evidence should be equated to proof of evidence. So do you get that? They're saying here the evidence is insufficient. There's insufficiency. And I think what this is really getting at is there's DNA, but they can't say that it's 100% Madeleine's DNA. There's blood, but they can't say 100% that it's Madeleine's blood, right? They found blood in the apartment. They found the scent of death. They weren't able to 100% say whose it is. And so as a result, the court's saying, guys, you found something, but you just haven't quite met the standard of, reasonable doubt. So doubt exists. And that's why I called my book about this case Doubt. Anyone who's absolutely certain either way of what has happened, you can't be. There's doubt. There's doubt about the Mccann's innocence, but there's also doubt about the Mccann's guilt, right? It went on to say, let me just finish this. It's true that the aforementioned criminal inquiry ended up being archived, namely because none of the apparent evidence that led to the appellants being made arguidos was subsequently confirmed or consolidated. Now, when you think about the evidence that needed to be confirmed or consolidated, a lot of that evidence was cadaver dog evidence. And this case was archived, I think, in July 2008, while the whole Zapata case was sort of falling apart. If they'd waited a bit longer to archive the case, who knows whether there would have been a different outcome. Also, if this case had happened 5 or 10 years later when cadaver dog evidence was a lot more mainstream, a lot more accepted, who knows if there would have been a different outcome. Something else to mention is sorry, I'm just looking at a comment here, Justine Brown. The Mccanns would be innocent until proven guilty if they were charged, but outside of that, they can't be presumed innocent. Enchanted Life says your poll is delusional, really. Let's have a look at the poll. So right now the poll says, does this ruling mean the Mccanns have lost the right to be presumed innocent? Yes, but it also means they have the right to not be presumed guilty. So you've got to really bring those two together, right? Okay, I think we need to get rid of you. Jeepers. Must say that's one of the nastiest persons I've seen in chat ever. That was definitely quite interesting. Whoever you are, you excelled yourself for being one of the nastiest people I've ever seen in chat. Anyway, so it says here the archive ruling raises serious concerns relating to the truth of the allegation that Madeleine was kidnapped. In other words, what they're saying there, let me just bring that up. They don't think that Madeleine was kidnapped. In other words, if you think about what's being alleged here, if you say it looks like we found blood and DNA, we can't 100% link it to Madeleine. We can maybe link it 60% or 70%. Well, that suggests she wasn't taken away and she's gone somewhere else. It suggests she was never abducted to begin with. In other words, the cadaver dog evidence is a hinge where you either say she died and that's the end of it, or she was abducted because I don't agree with the cadaver dog, and now you go in your merry way and you have it like, could it be this abductor? Could it be that one, this one, that one, the next one, right? That's really what kind of the issue is. But according to this judgment, they say the archive ruling raises serious concerns relating to the truth of the allegation that Madeleine was kidnapped. Who made the allegation that Madeleine was kidnapped? Her parents. So basically what the Supreme Court said is we are not ruling you guys innocent, and we're also not really accepting the kidnapping thing, but also we don't really have enough evidence either way, really, right? That's really what they were saying. That's exactly it. The abduction theory doesn't hold water. Now, if you think about the entire what do you call it? Netflix thing. It's in the whole thing is about a pedophile abduction, basically apologia. The entire Netflix documentary thing, The Disappearance of Madeleine McCann, is an attempt to carve in stone this idea that she was definitely abducted and the parents are definitely not guilty. You should really pay attention to what is said when they deal with the cadaver dogs. The subtle way that they undermine that evidence to say, no, it really doesn't mean anything, right? If it means nothing, if it's so pathetic evidence, why does the European Court of Human Rights refer to it? If it's so piffly pathetic evidence, why does it come up in this ruling? Do I sound a little bit kind of emotional? Let's have a look at your comments here. Yeah, so Bria and Sharon, just look out for that kind of nonsense. It is something we don't really expect on this channel, but I guess one's got to be careful. Okay, so let me continue with this, the ruling. So do you see it refers to biological and blood samples? I think biological samples is a kind of a different reference to DNA, but it refers to detected by British sniffer dogs. This is from the ruling from the European Court of Human Rights. It obviously means something to them. They saw something substantive in it. The British media either seem to suffer from amnesia or there's like selective reasoning going on. But the European Court of Human Rights said that's important, right? They're talking about what was found inside the holiday apartment and in the trunk of the vehicle that the applicants had rented a few days after their daughter's disappearance. Now, if you think about this, how on earth could you have a situation where possibly Madeleine's DNA or biological evidence appeared in a vehicle that came into the story like weeks and weeks later? Well, if you go to the Zapata case and you say, how on earth can cadaver dogs find traces of cadaver in like a basement and then also a storage locker? Doesn't make any sense. Well, what happens if you trust what the dogs are saying and you say, well, what happens if someone has been moved from one place to another place to another place, like almost a relay, right? And Zapata went to a lot of effort to hide human remains. So the question is, in this case, did someone go to a lot of effort to hide human remains, or did someone go to the effort to abduct someone in the middle of a hotel where people were walking around all the time? Um, and it's quite difficult to abduct a child and then they're not going to cry out in the you're a stranger carrying them somewhere. And there were two other children lying right next to Madeleine. Are they not going to cry out either? And the crazy thing was, when Kate Mccann came to attend to her children, the other two kids were fast asleep, and they continued to be fast asleep. So it's like Madeleine was out of the picture, and these two very young children were like, I don't want to say the word, but they were extremely sleepy. They didn't wake up. Thanks a lot, Titsub. Thanks very much. So again, let's go back to this ruling. As a result of what the sniffer dogs found, and finding it in the apartment and in the vehicle, the parents were placed under investigation in September 2007. Amaral spoke about a lawyer, I think he called her a juror, but a legal practitioner who was the neighbor of the Mccanns, who actually saw what she thought was the Mccanns airing out their vehicle. Seemed like overnight all the doors and all the windows and everything was open. That's something I think he said in the documentary, right? And this woman wanted to be off the record, but it was apparently a neighbor saw what some people interpreted as the vehicle being aired. And I mean, overnight is a bit strange. So was there some kind of suspicious things going on? So it goes on to say they were suspected of having hidden their daughter's body following her death, possibly as a result of an accident inside the apartment, and of having staged an abduction. So in other words, you abduct your own child's body and then you say somebody else did it, right? Those proceedings were discontinued in July 2008, right? Anyway, these were the suspicions. They said that Madeleine may have died in an accident, and I must say I agree with that. I think that is likely. There are people who think that Madeleine was murdered or something. I don't think that that's the case. I also don't think Madeleine overdosed. I know that's been a very popular theory. I also think Madeleine died in an accident. I think she died in a fall. I've gone to Praia de Luge, and there's a kind of a pavement area under the balcony, and the balcony is a very shallow type balcony with a kind of a railing on that a child could climb onto. And I suspect Madeleine may have climbed onto this railing, almost like a jungle gym. That particular hotel did have a jungle gym. Anyway, if she had fallen off that particular point, and it's quite tricky because there's bougainvillea branches all over there. But if she had fallen, she would have possibly fallen chest first onto the edge of this sort of paving that is directly below that balcony. And that could have caused a very severe chest injury, right? Which, if you try to resuscitate her, could have caused arterial kind of splatter, which I think there's arguably evidence of that behind the couch, that there's a possibility that there was an attempt to resuscitate her. That's in the police report. That is something that I think the police speculated on as well, certainly in terms of the indicators that they found on the wall, the patterns that they found, I think even on the curtains. Dan says, in America, the presumption of innocence is absolute. I don't think it's a difference between American law and British law. I don't think that's the difference here, because they did go to court. And I've just told you that they lost in court. And I think you are missing the legal pot in a way. So I disagree with you, Dan. I'm not sure if you know the law very well. Anyway, so in October 2007, quite late. So after the cadaver dog alerts, after they were made suspects, right? They were made suspects in September. Amaral was removed from the investigation. Let me bring this up. Just do that. Not quite sure why it's so big now. I think I'm just going to do it one image at a time. Okay. Yeah, Yin Yang says, imagine the same kind of findings in the Summer Wells case, right? So where are we? I think we're somewhere here. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. I think I've just gone a bit ahead. It's this is the right slide. Sorry about that. This is the right slide. Starts with biological samples. Sorry about that. Okay, now we're in the right place. In October 2007, Inspector Amaral was removed from the investigation. He retired in July 2008. In the same month, he published a book in which he alleged, among other claims, as follows, right? So these are the claims that I think the McCanns were very upset with. He basically wrote, Madeleine Mccann died inside the apartment. An abduction was staged. Death could have occurred following a tragic accident. Evidence proved negligence on the part of the parents with regard to the care and safety of the children. Amaral also gave a newspaper interview in which he repeated his theory. The book was subsequently adapted as a documentary program, which was made commercially available from April 2009, right? So it seems like he's not accusing the parents of killing Madeleine. I think the worst thing he's accusing them of is abducting Madeleine's remains. That's really the horrible, unacceptable thing that the detective thought. And we find that defamatory. How dare you say a thing like that? It goes on to say, in consequence, the applicants, that's the McCanns, brought interlocutory civil proceedings in Portugal, seeking an injunction. So, in other words, they're trying to shut him down, right? They're trying to get the book closed and thrown out, and you will not write a book about us, right? Get the documentary banned, and they want to seize Amaral's assets, right? So, in other words, think about it like this. PR, PR, PR. Look at us greeting the Pope. Look at us on TV. Look at us in this documentary. Look at us telling our story. But if anyone else tells the story, we're going to sue you. We're going to ban a documentary that you make. If you try and write a book, we're going to shut it down. But anyway, anything else is fine. If we write a book, it's fine. If we make endless documentaries and we appear in endless articles in the most heavily reported missing persons case in history, we appear on the news headlines, front page, front page, front page, front page. That's all fine. But how dare you write a book about us? And here we are 15 years later, the European Court of Human Rights saying he was justified. He was allowed to. Voice for Hope says, when did she go missing? She went missing on May 3rd, 2007. So more than 15 years ago this year. So they then lodged civil actions against the author of the book, the publisher, the production company, which had made and marketed the documentary, and the television channel, which had broadcast it. See, what they're doing is they're going after everybody. They're going after the author of the book, the publisher of the book, the production company that made and marketed the documentary, the television channel. They're basically saying, you guys criticizing us, we're going to shut you down, right? We're going to, or no, maybe not shut you down, we're going to shut down this narrative, right? And if you go and look at the case files of the John Benet Ramsey case, and you go and look at the case files of the Madeleine McCann case, go and have a look at how many people are sued, how many people who try to write books are sued, how many people who try to make documentaries are sued. A great example in the John Benet Ramsey case is the CBS documentary. We're going to sue you for $750 million. How dare you think about a certain thing, right? Same thing here. Lots and lots of publications sued. Lots and lots of publications sued. And so when I wrote my book about the McCanns, people said, I don't understand why you're writing about ravens. I don't understand why you're using this device. I really don't understand. I don't understand why you're writing it in a strange way. Why are you doing that? People just couldn't understand it. Anyway, so despite trying to sue the book, the publisher, sorry, the author of the book, the publisher, the production company, the television channel, it was dismissed by Portuguese courts. So despite the attempt to do that, the Portuguese court said no. And then the Supreme Court delivered two judgments on 31st January and 21st March, respectively, in which it considered that there'd been no unlawful interference with the applicant's rights to their reputation, and that the principle of the presumption of innocence was not relevant to the case. So I'm not sure where that fellow was who made this point earlier. Dan's pick says the presumption of innocence is not relevant to the case. It's not really a case that it's US law that is different or better than this law. It's not that at all. It is not, it's not got to do with that. How can you have a presumption of innocence if through the course of the investigation you find evidence, and based on that evidence, you, following all the necessary protocols, you have someone made a suspect? Then the presumption of innocence changes to some extent. And then when you then go to court, I would agree that before you go to court, the presumption of innocence should remain. But when you do go to court, then the question is, well, what happens to the presumption then? Well, what the court said, and that's why we have this article, is they've not been ruled innocent. The presumption of innocence was tested. It's also noted that the statements made by Amaral had not been new. That's so important. He's not the first guy who came along and said, this behavior is not, or there's something going on here. Some statements are inconsistent, right? He wasn't the first guy to say that. He wasn't the guy who made them suspects. They were made, he was kicked off the investigation. Actually, I think he was kicked off the investigation after they were made suspects. But it wasn't his call to make them suspects. Anyway, it says, they were set out in a police report of 10 September 2007, itself contained in the investigation file to which the press had been given access. So the press had been given access to this police report. So if the press had ever reported on them being suspicious, and they did, the British media reported on it, then how can you say the guy who wrote this book defamed them by saying, I think what they did may have been suspicious? It's already been in the mainstream media. So that's quite a good and clever argument, I think. You can't say, and you kind of have the same argument in Depp versus Heard, where Johnny Depp is saying, Amber said something and it caused me to lose everything or whatever. My entire career was scuppered because of what she said. If you actually go through the narrative, he had lost the franchise already with Disney. That's a fact. But apparently the jury, like in that case, the jury didn't really pay attention to that. The timing's a bit off. We're not really going to pay attention to that. Something like that, where the timing and how the media gets hold of stories, it's a matter of fact. Like at that time, that was known. Well, at that time, that was known. At that time, that person said that. Well, at that time, that person said that. And a jury may not have the sense to see the legality of it. Well, you can bet your bottom dollar a European court of very learned legal professionals, they are going to pay attention to that. Then it goes on to say, it also noted, it further held that these statements, which had thus already been widely commented and discussed, represented the subject of public interest. So it's also not just somebody putting something out into the public domain that didn't exist there before. It's in the public interest. The public want to know about it, but they also need to know about it. And besides that, the McCanns were public figures. If anything, the worst thing that they did to shoot themselves in the foot legally was make themselves public figures, because that then makes you, to some extent, fair game for public discourse, right? Now, I would say, if the McCanns could have done this all over again, should they have just not gone the PR route? Well, I think the PR route has served their interests handsomely. They've earned a fortune in terms of public donations. Right now, the Madeleine McCann Fund is worth almost £1 million. So the PR thing has created a huge safety net for them. If they ever had to go to trial and they were found, and if they ever had to pay a huge amount of damages or compensation, it wouldn't cost them anything. They would just be able to pay from the public purse or from the public's donations, right? So the PR narrative has served them extremely well, and it's also meant that they seem to have a lot of public sympathy 15 years later. The question is, how much is the PR narrative going to continue from this point onwards? That's the question. The question is, how much is public sympathy going to continue with them from this point onwards? And I think the answer is, it is going to continue, but I also think this should be a turning point. This should be a turning point where people like the news media, especially the British news media, acknowledge that there are certain problems with the abduction case. It's not, there's only an abduction, that's the only possibility here. There's certain problems with that. And legal professionals recognize that. Journalists seem to be not sure what's going on. Not sure whether the editors say, we are going to take this route to save us from legal liability, or to sell magazines or to sell newspapers. I don't know. I don't know what their call is. But I don't know. Are we going to continue paying lip service to fake news that only tells one side of a story? Brenda Lee writes, finally, someone is stopping these people. And I've got to say, if you're somebody who all these years has sympathized with the Ramseys, all these years you've said, I feel so sorry for them. I feel so sympathetic. I really, really feel sorry for them. They really deserve our sympathy and compassion. Within a few days of Madeleine's disappearance/death, they were out jogging. And they jogged quite often. They were quite often seen jogging. So they seem to deal with her disappearance/death quite well. I mean, they were able to go jogging. Me and my girlfriend broke up a couple of weeks ago, and I haven't really been exercising at all. Today I went swimming. It kind of affected me a little bit emotionally. They were able to go out jogging shortly after. they were criticized in the media for apparently not grieving. And you could say that that was cruel, but that is nevertheless what happened. They were criticized in the media. They were also criticized for having such a slick media campaign that before you knew it, they had a website up and running. I think they had a website up and running by the 9th of May. I could be wrong, but that their website was out there and doing its thing, and it was at some point I think it was getting the most traffic of any website ever. I'm not sure if I'm overstating it, but they were getting record amounts of traffic, huge amounts of donations. And so again, if you say, I really feel sorry for them, and I really uh, I really feel sympathy for them. I think the other side of that story is, think about the lives that have been wrecked in the aftermath of the Mccann case. I've gone to Praia de Luz myself. I've gone to the Ocean Club in person myself. That hotel, I'm not sure if it's the owner of the hotel or whatever, but basically what was there eventually went bankrupt. The hotel ceased to exist because of the negative publicity. Praia de Luz as a holiday center suffered because of bad publicity. So if the McCanns got good publicity, if the McCanns got the story that they are, deserving of sympathy and deserving of donations, the flip side to that was all of these documentaries that they got involved with had a deleterious effect on Portugal, where staff got fired or got staff got let go of. People lost their jobs, not one or two. I don't know if it went into hundreds, but certainly probably dozens of people lost their jobs. And it goes on and on and on. One of them was the detective Amaral. He also lost his job. He'd been working for a long time, and he wasn't working as a detective 1 year after the Madeleine McCann case. He was thrown off the case, I think 3 or 4 months later. Was he thrown off the case because he was right? Or was he thrown off because he was wrong? Was he thrown off because he was getting on the right track, or was he thrown off because he was a hothead? So, I think if you think about the lives that have been ruined and wrecked by the Madeleine McCann case, think about that aspect as well when you want to be very sympathetic towards the McCanns. I've got to say, when I saw this verdict, when I saw this ruling, I felt a sense of relief. Like, at last, this devastating circus is sort of coming to an end. I'm not naive enough to think that it's over, but I think the impetus is going to start going out of it, right? Thank goodness, because how much longer could this circus have gone on? And the answer is probably for as long as it took, on and on and on and on. And who knows, maybe there's going to be an appeal, and maybe the McCanns will win the appeal. I would love to see whether they are going to appeal. And the reason I say that is, I think the outcome for this particular case was a fait accompli about a year ago. Do you guys know that about a year ago, the McCanns were approached and asked if they wanted to settle, and they said, they asked if they wanted to settle. Hold on, I've got it the wrong way around. Instead of reading this out, let me just go to the actual thing. So I'm trying to find, I've put out so much links here that I can't actually find what I'm looking for. Oh, I think I have it over here. So here is the article. Court battle, Madeleine McCann's parents to find out this year if they've won legal battle against ex-cop, right? That was from The Sun. And that was dated May 2021, more than a year ago. And so this is what we knew more than a year ago. The Mccann legal team said they were willing to settle, but Portugal refused their offer. So I don't know if you can see what that means is they wanted to actually settle this case, and one wonders, did they want to do it quietly, right? So one presumes that the European Court of Human Rights got back to them, and I'm speculating, I really don't know. You know, one presumes that there may have been some interaction with them, you know, and then they said they were willing to settle, but Portugal weren't. And I think that shows you Portugal felt vindicated in their case. Portugal felt that they had a strong case. And I think it shows that the McCanns didn't think they had a strong case, right? And what does it show where we are right now? The fact that the McCanns lost, right? Well, they didn't have a strong case. That's why they lost. They wanted to settle because they could possibly see that they were going to lose. That's how I interpret it. Okay, let's have a look at some of your comments here. Definitely. So I want to quickly refer to this poll that I put up. And the poll reads, I put this up before the verdict came out. Who do you think is going to win in terms of the ruling? 18% said McCann's are going to win, which is the second most. Then only 11% said Detective wins, and then Portugal, and nobody wins. And I must say, I was quite shocked at the results of the poll, and I've got to say, increasingly, I put up polls and I disagree with the majority of people who respond to them. I don't know how you can say that nobody wins here. I don't know how you can say that nobody wins, because here is a detective that has been battling the McCanns to publish his book, and the McCanns have been battling to have his book not be published and whatnot, right? And the McCanns have actually won the PR battle for the past 15 years. In other words, they've won one after another PR victory. They've basically established their story, minus the cadaver dogs, in the public consciousness. The Netflix documentary series, The Disappearance of Madeleine McCann, is yet another PR triumph for them. And you can say, oh, they had nothing to do with it. Nevertheless, the McCann, that's a £20 million documentary. That's how much it cost, and came out while the European Court of Human Rights had to deliberate on this case. Quite interesting, the timing of that. And so the fact that the Mccanns didn't win is huge. It's not that nobody wins. They lost. And you could say that, you could argue that technically Portugal wins, but no, the detective won. The detective's arguments were seen as to be sound. And I can tell you now, if you're the detective in this case, you're not going to be feeling like a loser. You're not going to be feeling like I didn't win anything. You're going to be feeling like I did win. And if you're the Mccanns, you're going to be feeling like we lost, not we won, or not nobody wins, right? Again, this idea that this isn't a competition and who cares what the outcome is, are you ridiculous? I would love to see you go to trial and spend a fortune on a trial, and where fortunes are hanging in the balance and reputations are hanging in the balance, and you say, oh, nobody really wins in this case. Of course somebody wins. Of course somebody loses. And I get the faraway perspective where you say, well, whenever somebody goes to court, nobody wins, because only the lawyers win. But I think it's being a bit ridiculous. In this case, either the Mccanns win or the detective wins. And the ruling went against the Mccanns. Why do you think the headlines read, Mccanns lose, Mccanns lose, Mccanns lose? Because they didn't win. So it is a contest. It's a legal contest. When it's Depp versus Heard, everyone wants to know, is Heard going to win, or is Depp going to win? So to say that nobody wins is really ridiculous. Of course somebody wins. Of course it's all about somebody winning and somebody losing. Of course it's that binary. Yeah, no, it's very, very strange. Very, very strange. Okay, I'm going to try and get through the last bit of the ruling. It's not really that much to go. I'm going to skip complaints, procedure, and composition. And I'm going to go to Article 8. Let's bring that up. The court noted that the contested statements by Amaral in the book, documentary program, and interview concerned the applicant's alleged involvement in hiding their daughter's body based on an assumption that they had staged an abduction and on a presumption of negligence towards her. In the court's view, these statements were sufficiently serious to render Article 8 of the Convention applicable. It further noted that the book, the documentary based on it, and the interview given by Amaral to a daily newspaper concerned a debate of public interest. It considered that the contested statements constituted value judgments which had sufficient factual basis. Right? What he's saying wasn't just speculation, it wasn't just rumination, it had sufficient factual basis. There was evidence, there were dogs that barked. There were, when they tested those things, they did find biological traces. I think a big problem with the prosecution of this case was that the Portuguese authorities didn't put enough stake in cadaver dogs until it was sort of too late. You actually had a South African coming there saying, you guys should get cadaver dogs, and then the Portuguese going to the British to get them. That's how it actually happened. Anyway, it says, the elements on which the scenario advanced by Amaral was based were those which had been gathered during the investigation, right? So when he made his claims in his book, it's not based on, oh, I think this or oh, I think that. It's based on what the police investigated, what the police found, and also what had been brought to the public's attention. Additionally, this theory had been entertained in the context of the criminal investigation and had even led to the applicants being placed under investigation on September 7, 2007. Now, if you think about it, how ridiculous can you be to say, here is an investigation, and the investigation finds we think you guys are suspects. We're going to arrest you. And then you have the detective fired. The detective comes afterwards and he says, well, I'm just going to write about what happened. And then they say, no, you can't. We have got the right to be presumed innocent. Huh? Anyway, it goes on. Further, the criminal case had attracted extensive public interest both nationally and internationally and had given rise to considerable discussion and controversy. As the Lisbon Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Appeal had noted, the disputed statements had undeniably formed part of a debate of public interest, and Amaral's theory had accordingly been one of several opinions. So what they're also saying is that his theory wasn't like new, wasn't like groundbreaking. He wasn't inventing the wheel. The suspicions were already out in the public domain. People were already openly thinking and pontificating, including in the mainstream media. It also noted that the criminal case had been discontinued by the prosecutor's office on 21 July 2008. That's really the date that the prosecution just said, look, I don't know if we can secure a conviction. It's basically the Portuguese version of the DA's office in Boulder, right? Timmy's not used to me doing it at this time. It's normally when we go for a walk. Anyway, this is really the Portugal's version of the district attorney in the John Benet Ramsey case, basically saying we have insufficient evidence to proceed with an investigation, and then nothing happens. And I must say, in the same vein of the John Benet Ramsey case, I don't know whether I would agree that ultimately there was insufficient evidence, right? Knowing what we know now, I really don't know if one could say there was insufficient evidence, because the grand jury didn't think so. And so in this case, I wonder whether there was also really insufficient evidence when you look at how much evidence there was. But anyway, that is how it goes. You kind of get the sense that there was a hell of a lot of PR and money and shenanigans going on in the Ramsey case and in the Mccann case. You sort of wonder to what extent politics and relationships had a role, had actually a role in deciding the outcome, not the merits of the case. You just wonder what is really the underlying factor. For me, I've always wondered, was the desire to create the European Union, and bear in mind they were starting to do that in Lisbon. There was the Treaty of Lisbon in, I think, December 2007. Was that a factor why the Portuguese and Europe didn't want to upset Britain, because they wanted Britain to be part of the European Union? So, prosecuting a British couple, would that have upset British taxpayers and British politicians and whatnot? Was that a factor in why they kind of threw in the towel? Because that kind of feels like what happened. I'm just saying, one sometimes wonders when a relatively simple investigation becomes so weird and so complicated and with so much pageantry, you sort of wonder what is actually going on. Like, what's the actual story behind the story? And I don't mean a conspiracy. I mean, what are the actual mechanisms taking place? I must tell you, when I started writing about the Madeleine McCann case, I thought I've done quite well in this case. I thought I came up with some good insights in that case. But when it came to Madeleine McCann, I thought, this is probably going to be extremely difficult. This is going to be the toughest case that I've yet undertaken. And it turned out once you pulled away all those layers of PR, once you got through the distortion, it was actually quite a simple case. And all you really had to do was pay attention for long enough. Then it's not such a complicated case. And a lot of true crime is like that. Okay. In this connection, the court held that had the book been published before the decision by the prosecutor's office to discontinue the proceedings, the statements in question could potentially have undermined the applicant's right to be presumed innocent. So goes on to say, given that the statements were in fact made after the case had been discontinued, it had been the applicant's reputation guaranteed by Article 8 of the Convention and the public's perception of them which had been at stake. So in other words, they're saying, by the time the book came out, the case was basically settled, and it was also the time that the PJ files would be released. Very little in his book, I think, wasn't in the PJ files. I think the big difference here was that the PR narrative for the McCanns was all the same. Pedophile abduction or abduction. The pedophile part only came later, actually. Abduction, abduction, abduction. And the other narrative, which you never heard, was, were the parents responsible? Were the parents involved? You never ever heard it. If anyone said it, they got sued. And now someone was saying that, and they were part of the investigation of the case, which means they were theoretically a credible source. How dare you say maybe the parents did something in the face of the PR narrative? Abduction. It was an abduction, a pedophile abduction. That's the only story that there is, right? Anyway. Yeah, pay attention to what they don't want you to notice. Blitzkrieg, I don't understand your question. Sorry, maybe I'm just a bit slow today. So I think we've got just a page left to go, so we'll just finish off with this. In the present case, the court nevertheless considered that even supposing that the applicant's reputation had been damaged, this had not been on account of the hypothesis put forward by Amaral. In other words, they're saying even if the reputation had been damaged, it wasn't because of him, but as a result of the suspicions expressed against them, which had led to their being placed under investigation. In other words, through the course of the police investigation, that is what caused their reputation to become damaged, because of evidence, right? Because of evidence that led to them being arrested. They weren't arrested. They were made arguidos. Them becoming arguidos damaged their reputation as a result of the natural process of the investigation, as a result of the cadaver evidence, etc., as a result of the testing of that evidence, as a result of where they got that evidence as well. It also says the information had been thus brought to the public's attention in some detail even before the investigation file had been made available to the media and the book in question had been published. With regard to the applicant's allegations of bad faith on Amaral's part, so applicants is the Jerry McCann and Kate McCann saying that Amaral had bad faith, right? The court noted that the book had been published 3 days after the proceedings had been discontinued, which implied that it had been written, then printed, while the investigation had still been underway. The court held that in choosing to make the book available for sale 3 days after it had been decided to discontinue the case, Amaral could, as a matter of prudence, have added a note informing the reader about the outcome of the proceedings. That's quite an interesting point. However, the failure to insert any such note could not in itself prove bad faith on his part. So it seems like the McCanns are saying he was supposed to say in his book, almost like a disclaimer, the McCanns have not been found guilty of any crime or something like that. He was supposed to have that as a kind of a disclaimer in his book. But the court said, no, that wasn't necessary. The court noted that the documentary did refer to the fact that the case had been discontinued. Furthermore, the applicants had continued their media campaign after the book's publication. So that's really important. Kate and Jerry McCann continued their media campaign after the book was published. So, they had a right of reply. They were able to carry on what they were doing, telling their story, and they wrote their own books. So what's wrong with that? It's our counter. What's wrong with that is they wanted to be able to tell their story, it seems as though, and not allow other people to tell a story that differed from the pedophile abductor narrative. So in other words, they could have their media campaign unhindered, unfettered, but they felt that they were justified in hindering and fettering the detective story. And I would love to know, does this mean that he can now publish his book in the UK? Can documentaries on his book be put in the UK? And I think the answer is no, because the UK is no longer part of the European Union. And in other words, the jurisdiction of the EU judgment, I'm not sure if it necessarily extends to Britain. So that's also quite interesting. Okay, let's finish with this part. They continued to give interviews to the international media. While the court understood that the book's publication had undeniably caused anger, anguish, and distress, it did not appear that the book had a serious impact on the applicant's social relations or on their legitimate and ongoing attempts to find their daughter. I must say that's a fantastic point, is if you say, did the book have an effect? And you say, yes, it did. Well, how big was the effect? Well, Amaral's book wasn't even published in England. So how could it have any effect? If you also compare the power and resiliency and the consistency of the PR narrative, and you think how the PR narrative was this massive balloon, right, that everybody saw, and Amaral's story was like this little mosquito that nobody saw. And then you say, yeah, but the mosquito is the real problem here. The court here is arguing that it really didn't have a serious impact. People didn't know really what he was saying. And the PR also just referred to him as the disgraced detective and whatever. And he was really villainized. He was seen as the bad guy. They were the good guys and he was the bad guy. So to say it had a serious impact on their reputations really didn't. But I also don't think it's fair to say it had no impact. It had a small impact. The court also specified that while admittedly the statements in question were based on Amaral's in-depth knowledge of the case file as a result of his role, remember he was the lead detective, there was no doubt that their content had already been known to the public. Given the extensive media coverage of the case and the fact that the investigation file had been subsequently made available to the media after the investigation had been closed. In other words, people knew a lot of what Amaral was saying anyway, or they could have known, because the case file was made public, right? The discovery. For that reason, it held that the contested statements were merely the expression of Amaral's interpretation of a high-profile case which had already been widely discussed. In addition, it did not appear that Amaral had been motivated by personal animosity towards the applicants. So in other words, they found no animus, they found no kind of intention. I'm trying to think of deficit, what they call it, when you intend to slander someone. There's got to be, can't quite think of the term. Yeah, it was translated, but that took a while. Bear in mind, it was in Portuguese to begin with. I'm trying to think of that term that is part of law. You've got to have the intent to, what's it? With malice. With malice. In other words, they're saying that he lacked malice. He was simply telling a story. He was not trying to get revenge. There wasn't animosity. He was simply saying, this is what, ill will. So, I don't know whether the same can be said in reverse. I don't know whether the same can be said that what the Mccann said about the detective didn't have any animosity. I don't know. My impression was that what was said about him was very nasty, very undermining. He lost his job effectively. You could argue that he may have quit his job to write the book, but I don't think, like, his life was never really the same after that. In other words, he was a policeman and then he wasn't, whereas the McCanns were doctors and then they continued to be doctors. So their lives didn't really change. His changed. Somebody left a really interesting comment. They said, can he sue them now? And I also wonder, can other people sue them who've previously been sued? I just wonder what the legal implications are for this judgment. Anyway, it goes on to say, it further noted that although the Supreme Court had been assessing the case at final instance, it had carried out a detailed analysis of the balance to be struck between the applicant's right to respect for their private life, and that is a right. You do have a right to respect for your private life, and I wish those covering the Kylie Rodney case, especially some of the teenagers in that, I wish they would bear that in mind. They actually have a right to privacy. Anyway, and Amaral's right to freedom of expression, that is the other side of the story. He does have the right to freedom of expression, as long as it's anchored in reasonable statements and in reasonable fact, reasonable, provable fact. And they were saying the way he interpreted the facts and evidence that he saw isn't unreasonable. It says here, the right to freedom of expression, assessing them in the light of the criteria identified in its case law and referring at length to the court's case law, having regard to the discretion afforded to the national authorities in the present case, the court saw no strong reason to substitute its own view for that of the Supreme Court. It could not therefore be stated that the national authorities had failed in their positive obligation to protect the applicant's right to respect for their private life within the meaning of Article 8 of the Convention. In other words, they're saying, broadly speaking, the Portuguese authorities protected the Mccanns, or they didn't infringe their rights. They're saying the Portuguese authorities, not so much the detective. And it followed there was no violation of Article 8 of the Convention. So today's verdict, I feel, was a foregone conclusion. I think you could see that it was coming since May last year that the McCanns then already were willing to settle. In a case that's been dominated by PR, is it a coincidence that the ruling happened when it did, when the entire British nation was fixed on the funeral pageantry of their monarch? If the forces at the center of this case that had pulled strings all along, if they had nothing to do with the scheduling of this verdict, well, then I think fate certainly has an ironic sense of humor, doesn't it? So if you guys are interested, these are the books that I've written on the Madeleine McCann case, right? I've written a trilogy. It's a Doubt trilogy. And then I've also written the Deep into Darkness series. It's these two books. These books were written based on my visits to Praia da Luz, based on going there and what I thought. Those are actually the US links to the books. This is the UK link. You can see it's got 89 ratings. So if you guys are interested, if you don't know me and you're new to the channel, you might be interested in my view of the case. You can try out Doubt. And then there's also Deep into Darkness. Deeper into Darkness has just gotten its 15th review. It's quite highly reviewed, average of 4.1 out of 5 and average of 4.3 out of 5. That's for Deep and Deeper into Darkness. So here's Deep into Darkness. If you guys are interested, let me just do that. It's available on Amazon Kindle Unlimited, and I think Doubt is also available as a paperback. I think of the 5 books, I think the best book of the 5 is this one, Deeper into Darkness. But they all build on one another, so you might want to read one after the other. They kind of build on one another. Deep into Darkness and Deeper into Darkness, I think are also, it's a good pair to put next to one another. Anyway, if you can't find them in terms of these links, just Google Madeleine McCann and my name and it should come up. Thanks a lot, Sharon. Are there any further questions or comments? Let's go to the poll. I see 54% say the McCanns have lost their right to be presumed innocent. So just over half of you are saying that. Now, to me, that is huge because it feels like the McCanns have been treated as innocent by the British media without exception. It feels like every single British publication has treated the McCanns as being innocent. Sky News, the BBC, The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Mirror. I'm saying every single news agency in Britain, major news agency, without exception, has basically treated them as being presumed innocent, right? This ruling challenges that, but not in a complete and absolute way. They also have the right not to be seen as guilty, but also not to be presumed innocent. So one does wonder how things are going to change from here on out. I also wonder what Madeleine's siblings make of this. Madeleine's siblings have grown up without Madeleine, and Madeleine's siblings have now seen what the news is. And one wonders, did they see the news or were they watching the Queen's funeral? Are they going to see the news? How are they going to respond to that? And imagine if you were in that position, that one of your siblings disappeared and your parents told a certain story that everyone else told as well, and then one day it comes up on the news that that there's another story as well, and that a European court saw some merit in that story. How do you respond to that? It's got to be difficult. Definitely got to be difficult. Thanks a lot, Ricardo. Appreciate it. Okay, guys, that is it for me. I've just hit on the 2-hour mark. I was actually surprised that it would take as long as it did. But as I say, this is a case that means quite a lot to me. It's the only high-profile case that I've gone to investigate in person. It's the only high-profile case I've gone to sort of snoop around and, at the same time that the crime actually happened, look at the lighting conditions at the time, measure the distance from the apartment to the sea, figure out the so-called abductor's route, and try and figure all of that out. It's the only case that I've done that and then gone on to write a book about it. So I invested quite a lot of my self in this particular story. Before fake news, before people started talking about fake news, the bogus PR narrative, the bogus narrative that is associated with this case, or let's put it this way, the counter narrative, or the media narrative, or the other narrative, whatever you want to call it. Basically, there are two narratives in this case. There's the narrative that something happened in the apartment and Madeleine has died. And then there's the other narrative that there's some kind of pedophile abductor, and it could be this one, that one, that one, that one. Right now, it's Christian Bruckner. And one wonders, now that we don't really need Christian Bruckner anymore to distract us from everything that's happening, what's going to happen? Are people going to forget about Christian Bruckner? He's not needed anymore. So is there going to still be nonsensical coverage about Christian Bruckner, the prime suspect? One just wonders. Where's that case going to go? One just wonders about that. But what I'm trying to say is, while I was covering this, I was very aware of two different narratives, and it sort of prepared me, I think, for the place where we are today, where fake news is all over, and you can make a lot of money out of fake news. That I've also realized. You can make money telling lies, and you can struggle to make a living telling the truth. And one wonders on what side of that dichotomy you have the Mccanns and Amaral. Is Amaral someone who made a huge fortune telling lies, or has Amaral struggled in his effort to try and tell the truth? What do you think the answer is to that? And why do you think the world is like that? Why do you think there is so much money in not telling the truth? Why do you think that that's the case? I just find it odd. You would think that money would be on the side of truth. For some reason, it's not. Is it because people want to hear lies? Is it because people want to be lied to? Is it because lies are... Think about the pedophile narrative and the alternative. Is the pedophile narrative somehow more dark and disturbing and sort of delicious, as disgusting as that word is in this context, right? Do we want to be titillated with dark ghost stories, or is that how pathetic we are, that we don't simply want to know what the truth is, we want to dress it up? And that's where we are as a world. As far as I'm concerned, the Madeleine McCann case has led to, whenever a child goes missing, they think it's an abduction, when that's not the first natural port of call. It's not the most logical. When a child goes missing, it doesn't mean that they've been abducted. But that's the legacy of the Madeleine McCann case. A child may have gone missing because they got lost, because there's a custody battle going on, because they ran away from home, because they're actually just around the corner, right? And that to me is the legacy about this case that I'm not very happy about, and I've tried to challenge. I've definitely tried to challenge it. Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Leslie. Yeah, Scariella says sensational. Sorry, I'm struggling to speak. Sensationalism is always more interesting. I kind of haven't had lunch, so I'm a little bit tired after swimming. Lies are a lot more exciting. Yeah. Angelina says, "Hi Nick, I've enjoyed many of your books. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it." Okay, guys, thank you very much. We await news in the Kylie Rodney case. We're going to see if something is going to be coming out today. But I want to thank all of you guys for joining me. If I've sounded quite emotional sharing this with you, it's because I do feel quite strongly about this case. I feel like the circus that has gone on has been unacceptable. And hopefully that circus is going to start going away, because it's I don't know. And as much as hopefully the circus in this case is receding, I really hope the circus that seems to be continuing with the JonBenet Ramsey case is going to go away. I've got a question for you, and I'm going to leave off on this thing. In the JonBenet Ramsey case, isn't the best piece of evidence the Ramsey ransom note? Isn't that by far the biggest piece of evidence, the clearest piece of evidence, the ransom note? So why do you want to pay attention to fragments of DNA that's neither here nor there? You've got this big ransom note that's 3 pages long, the War and Peace of ransom notes. This ransom note that's waving in your face like a flag, but no, you want to go and look at invisible, insufficient DNA. Why aren't you looking at the ransom note? Why are you not looking at the ransom note? Do you think you can answer that question? Anyway, thank you very much, May. Thanks a lot for that. Thanks for all the super chats. And guys, thanks a lot for joining me in this conversation. See you guys next time. Ciao.